The announcement came at 8:47 p.m., right after Dad had finished his speech about finally being free to enjoy the fruits of his labor with the people who truly mattered. I was standing by the kitchen island, helping myself to the catered spread that had cost more than most people's monthly rent, when my stepmother Diane's voice cut through the party chatter like a knife. "Everyone, can I have your attention for just a moment?" The conversations died down. About 40 people, Dad's colleagues, neighbors, Diane's friends, my half-siblings and their families, all turned toward the living room where she stood next to the massive stone fireplace, her champagne glass raised like a weapon. As we celebrate Robert's retirement and look forward to this new chapter of our lives, there's something we need to address. I felt a familiar knot forming in my stomach. In the 6 years since Dad had married Diane, she'd perfected the art of public humiliation disguised as family concern. Some of you may have noticed that we have a situation living in our home that really doesn't fit with where we are in life now. She looked directly at me, her smile sharp as broken glass. "My stepdaughter Jessica has been living here for the past year, despite being 28 years old. She claims she's working on some kind of business venture, but frankly, we haven't seen any evidence of success." A few people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. I recognized some of Dad's former co-workers, people who'd known me since I was a teenager, people who looked genuinely surprised by Diane's public attack. But I also saw the nodding heads of Diane's inner circle, her sister Patricia, her book club friends, my half-brother Marcus and his wife. People who had spent months listening to Diane's complaints about her freeloader stepdaughter. So tonight, as we celebrate new beginnings, I think it's time for Jessica to pack her things and find somewhere more appropriate for her lifestyle. The room was completely silent. I could feel 40 pairs of eyes on me, waiting to see how I would respond to being publicly evicted from my childhood home. "This house isn't for failures like you," Diane continued, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "It's time for you to learn to stand on your own 2 feet." I looked around the room at the faces of people I'd known for years. Some looked embarrassed. Others looked curious. A few looked pleased, as if they'd been waiting for this moment. Then I looked at my father. Dad was standing next to Diane, his arm around her waist, his expression neutral. Not supportive of her announcement, but not opposing it either. Just accepting it like he accepted everything else about his new life. The man who had once told me I could be anything I wanted to be was now standing silently while his wife called me a failure in front of 40 people. "I understand," I said quietly. Diane looked surprised. She'd clearly expected tears or anger, or some kind of dramatic scene that would justify her actions to the crowd. "You understand?" "I understand perfectly." I set down my champagne glass and walked toward the front door. "I'll get my things tomorrow." "Jessica, wait." Dad finally spoke, but I was already opening the door. "Enjoy your retirement party," I said, and stepped out into the cool October evening. As the door closed behind me, I could hear the party resuming, voices rising again, laughter returning, the celebration of Dad's retirement continuing without the family failure who had been graciously removed from the premises. I sat in my car for a few minutes, looking at the house I'd grown up in. The house where I'd learned to ride a bike in the driveway, where I'd had sleepovers and birthday parties, where I'd studied for college exams at the kitchen table. The house that Diane now considered too good for me. I pulled out my phone and made a call. "Marcus? It's Jessica Chin. Sorry to call so late, but I need you to accelerate the Morrison mortgage acquisition." "Yes, the one we discussed last month." "Tomorrow morning." "Perfect." Marcus Rivera was my investment attorney, one of the few people who knew the truth about what I'd been building for the past 3 years while everyone assumed I was unemployed and directionless. What they didn't know was that I'd been working 18-hour days building Sterling Capital Management, a private equity firm specializing in distressed real estate assets. What looked like unemployment to them was actually me running a business from my laptop, managing a portfolio worth over $200 million, including, as of tomorrow morning, the mortgage on 1247 Maple Grove Lane, my childhood home where I'd just been publicly humiliated and evicted. The next morning, I woke up in my downtown apartment, the same luxury high-rise apartment that Diane assumed I couldn't afford because I preferred to let people make their own assumptions about my finances. At 9:15 a.m. Marcus called. "It's done. Sterling Capital now owns the Morrison family mortgage. The foreclosure notice has been prepared and will be delivered within the hour." "Perfect." "And Marcus?" Make sure the delivery is made in person. I want them to understand exactly what's happening. At 9:47 a.m., I was sitting in my car outside the house when the process server arrived. Through the large front windows, I could see Diane in her silk bathrobe, cleaning up from the party. She opened the door expecting a package delivery. Instead, she received a foreclosure notice and a letter explaining that Sterling Capital Management had purchased her mortgage from the original lender and was exercising its right to accelerate payment due to violation of occupancy terms. I watched her face change as she read the documents. Confusion first, then disbelief, then something approaching panic. My phone rang 30 seconds later. Jessica. It was Dad, his voice tight with stress. There's been some kind of mistake. We just got papers saying our house is being foreclosed on, but our mortgage payments are current. The company says Sterling Capital Management bought our loan, but we've never heard of them. That's interesting, I said calmly. Do you know anything about this? You mentioned you were working on some kind of business thing. Dad, Sterling Capital Management is my company. I bought your mortgage this morning. Silence. Complete total silence. That's not possible. You don't have that kind of money. Actually, I have quite a bit more than that kind of money. Sterling Capital manages a portfolio of approximately $200 million in real estate assets across Northern California. More silence. But you've been unemployed for over a year. No, Dad. I've been building a business for over 3 years. There's a difference. I could hear Diane in the background, her voice shrill. What is she saying? How could she possibly own our mortgage? Dad put me on speaker. Jessica, I don't think. Put me on speaker or you can discuss this with my attorneys. A moment later, Diane's voice came through loud and clear. Jessica, this is some kind of joke, right? You can't possibly own our house. I don't own your house, Diane. I own your mortgage. There's a difference, but the practical effect is the same. I control whether you get to keep living there. This is ridiculous. You live off our charity. You can't even afford your own apartment. I looked up at my luxury high-rise apartment, then at the Tesla Model S in my assigned parking spot. Diane, I live in a 2,500 square foot apartment in the Meridian Tower. My rent is $8,000 a month. I drive a $95,000 Tesla. I carry an American Express black card. Would you like me to continue? You're lying. Am I? Tell me, what do you actually know about my life? When's the last time anyone in the family asked me about my work, my finances, or my living situation? Neither of them answered. I'll answer for you, never. You made assumptions based on the fact that I work from home and dress casually. You decided I was unemployed because I don't leave for an office job every morning. But Jessica, Dad said, his voice smaller now, if you have all this money, why were you living with us? Because you invited me to stay while I was building my business. Because I thought it would be nice to spend time with family. And because, honestly, I didn't realize how much Diane resented my presence until last night. So what happens now? Diane asked, and for the first time I heard fear in her voice. I looked at the foreclosure notice in my hand. The document that could force them out of their home within 30 days. The house where Dad had planned to enjoy his retirement, where Diane had hosted her book club meetings and dinner parties. Now you have a choice, I said. You can acknowledge that you misjudged me completely, apologize for last night's humiliation, and we can work out reasonable terms for you to continue living in the house. Or, Dad asked, or you can continue believing I'm a failure who couldn't possibly own your mortgage, and you can find somewhere else to live within 30 days. This is blackmail. Diane exploded. No, Diane. This is business. Something I learned by watching Dad build his career over 30 years of hard work and smart decisions. But why? Dad asked. Why didn't you tell us about your success? Why let us think you were struggling? I thought about that question. The real answer was complicated years of small slights, dismissive comments, and assumptions that had gradually trained me to stop sharing my achievements with people who wouldn't appreciate them. Dad, do you remember Christmas dinner 2 years ago? I tried to tell everyone about my first major acquisition, a $15 million commercial property deal. Diane interrupted me to ask if I'd considered getting a real job, with benefits. Silence. Or last Thanksgiving when I mentioned I was hiring my first employees. Marcus said it was cute that I was playing businesswoman, but I should think about settling down and starting a family instead. We were trying to help, Diane said weakly. No, you were trying to make me fit into your idea of what my life should look like. Every time I shared a success, someone found a way to diminish it or redirect the conversation to something more practical. So you decided to just not tell us? I decided to focus on building something meaningful rather than constantly justifying my choices to people who had already decided I was making mistakes. My phone buzzed with a text from my asset manager. The Riverside Plaza acquisition closed this morning. $47 million. Congratulations. Dad, while we're talking, I just closed on another property. Riverside Plaza downtown, $47 million. That brings Sterling Capital's total assets under management to just over $250 million. I could hear Diane whispering frantically to Dad in the background. Jessica, Dad said finally, we need to talk. Face to face. Can you come over? To the house I was evicted from last night? Please. I looked at the foreclosure notice again, then at my childhood home where I'd spent 22 years learning what it meant to be part of a family. I'll be there in 20 minutes. When I arrived, Dad and Diane were waiting in the living room. The party decorations were still up, streamers and balloons celebrating Dad's retirement, the beginning of what was supposed to be the best phase of his life. Instead, they were sitting on the couch looking like they'd just learned their house was built on a sinkhole. Jessica, Dad stood up as I entered. First, I owe you an apology. A big one. For what specifically? For letting Diane humiliate you last night. For not defending you when you were attacked in front of 40 people. For assuming you were unsuccessful instead of asking about your actual life. I sat down in the armchair across from them, the same chair where I used to sit as a teenager, telling Dad about school and friends and dreams for the future. And I prompted. Diane shifted uncomfortably. And I owe you an apology too. For everything I said last night. For calling you a failure, for demanding you leave, for making assumptions about your financial situation. What else? She looked confused. What do you mean? Diane, you didn't just make one mistake last night. You've spent 6 years treating me like an unwelcome guest in my own childhood home. Last night was just the culmination. I didn't realize. You didn't realize that constantly asking when I was going to get a real job was dismissive? You didn't realize that introducing me to your friends as Robert's daughter who's still figuring things out was condescending? Dad winced. Jessica, we thought we were being supportive. Encouraging you to find stability. Dad, I had stability. I had success. I had a business that was growing faster than I'd ever imagined possible. What I didn't have was a family that bothered to ask about any of it. I pulled out my phone and showed them the Sterling Capital Management website, professional photos of commercial properties, testimonials from satisfied clients, press coverage of major acquisitions. This is what I've been building while you thought I was unemployed. A real estate investment firm that's generated over $40 million in profits in the past 3 years. Diane stared at the phone screen. But you never dressed like a successful businesswoman. You wore jeans and t-shirts around the house. As I was at home, Diane. When I'm in business meetings, I wear business attire. When I'm working from my home office, I dress comfortably. Most successful people do. Show them the Forbes article, Dad said quietly. I looked at him surprised. You know about the Forbes article? I found it this morning. After the foreclosure notice arrived, I Googled your company. He looked embarrassed. I should have done that years ago. I pulled up the article, Rising Stars in Real Estate, How Young Investors Are Reshaping California's Commercial Market. There was a full-page profile of Sterling Capital Management, complete with my professional headshot and details about our acquisition strategy. Jessica Chin, 28, has built one of the fastest-growing private equity firms in Northern California, Dad read aloud. Her company's focus on undervalued commercial properties has generated exceptional returns for investors while revitalizing overlooked neighborhoods. Diane was reading over his shoulder, her face getting paler with every paragraph. Chen's approach combines traditional real estate expertise with innovative financing strategies, she continued reading. Her success has made her one of the youngest commercial property magnates on the West Coast. There's more, I said, scrolling through my phone. Wall Street Journal piece last month about women in private equity. San Francisco Business Times cover story about young entrepreneurs. 3 speaking engagements at real estate investment conferences next quarter. The room was completely quiet except for the ticking of the grandfather clock Dad had bought to celebrate his first promotion 20 years ago. "So what happens now?" Dad asked finally. "That depends on you. What do you want from us?" I thought about that question. What did I want from the people who had spent years dismissing my dreams and culminated by publicly humiliating me? "I want you to see me for who I actually am, not who you assumed I should be. I want you to understand that success comes in many different forms, and just because someone's path doesn't look like yours doesn't mean they're failing." "We can do that," Diane said quickly. "Can you? Because this isn't just about acknowledging that I'm wealthy, Diane. This is about fundamentally changing how you think about me and my choices." "I understand. Do you? Because 3 months from now, when I'm wearing jeans and working from my laptop in the kitchen, are you going to see a successful CEO managing a multimillion-dollar business? Or are you going to see the same failure you wanted to evict last night?" She was quiet for a long moment. I don't know. But I want to try." Dad leaned forward. "Jessica, can you forgive us? Can we start over?" I looked around the living room where I'd grown up, at the family photos on the mantel, the piano where I'd practiced for school recitals, the window seat where I'd read hundreds of books while dreaming about my future. "I can forgive you," I said finally. "But I can't forget how quickly you were willing to throw me out when you thought I wasn't successful enough to deserve a place in the family. What does that mean for us going forward?" "It means our relationship is going to be different. I'm not the struggling daughter who needs your guidance anymore. I'm a successful businesswoman who owns your mortgage and controls whether you get to keep living in this house." The power dynamic in the room had shifted completely. 6 hours ago I was the failure being evicted. Now I was the person deciding whether they got to stay. "So what are your terms?" Dad asked. "First, you get to stay in the house. I'll restructure the mortgage with reasonable payments and terms. This is your home and I want you to enjoy your retirement here." Relief flooded both their faces. "Second, no more assumptions about my life or my work. If you want to know how I'm doing, ask me directly instead of making judgments based on surface appearances." "Agreed," Diane said immediately. "Third, if you ever again publicly humiliate me or treat me like a charity case, our business relationship becomes strictly professional. You'll deal with my attorneys and property managers, not with me." "That's fair," Dad nodded. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the neighborhood where I'd grown up. In the distance I could see the downtown skyline where 3 of my properties rose above the city like monuments to everything I'd built while they thought I was failing. "There's one more thing." "What's that?" "I want you to understand that I didn't buy your mortgage to control you or get revenge. I bought it because Sterling Capital specializes in acquiring undervalued real estate assets, and your property fit our investment criteria." "So this was just business?" "It started as business. But when I realized it was your mortgage, I saw an opportunity to teach you something important." "What's that?" I turned back to face them. "That assumptions about success can blind you to the actual achievements happening right in front of you. You spent 3 years watching me build a multimillion-dollar business and saw failure because it didn't look like what you expected success to look like." Dad nodded slowly. "We made a terrible mistake." "Yes, you did. But mistakes can be learning opportunities if you're willing to change." My phone rang, Marcus Rivera calling with updates on 2 new acquisitions we were finalizing. "I have to take this," I said. "It's my attorney calling about a $23 million property deal we're closing today." As I answered the phone, I watched Dad and Diane's faces change again. They were finally beginning to understand that their failure stepdaughter was actually running a sophisticated business operation that generated more income in a month than most people earned in a year. "Marcus, good morning." "Yes, the Riverside deal closed successfully. Move forward with the Harbor Point acquisition. Schedule the due diligence for next week. I'll review the contracts tonight." When I hung up, Dad was staring at me with something approaching awe. "You really do own a multimillion-dollar company." "I really do. And you built it while we thought you were unemployed." "I built it despite the fact that you thought I was unemployed. There's a difference." Diane looked genuinely shaken. "Jessica, I feel terrible about everything I said. Not just last night but for years. All those comments about getting a real job, about settling down, about being practical. Those comments taught me something valuable, Diane. They taught me that external validation isn't necessary for success. I learned to measure my achievements by results, not by other people's approval." Can you teach us? Dad asked quietly. Teach you what? How to see success differently. How to recognize achievement even when it doesn't look conventional. How to be the kind of family that supports dreams instead of dismissing them. I looked at the foreclosure notice still sitting on the coffee table, the document that had changed everything in the span of one morning. I can teach you that, I said. But it starts with curiosity instead of assumptions. Next time someone in the family is pursuing an unconventional path, try asking questions about their work instead of offering advice about what they should be doing instead. We can do that, Diane said. Good. Because Marcus is getting married next month and he's bringing his boyfriend. Are you going to ask them about their wedding plans and their life together, or are you going to make assumptions about what their relationship should look like? Dad looked surprised. Marcus has a boyfriend? Marcus has been with David for 3 years. They're getting married in Napa Valley next month. But since no one ever asks Marcus about his personal life, you probably didn't know that. Why doesn't Marcus talk about his relationship? For the same reason I stopped talking about my business. Because he learned that this family has strong opinions about what people's lives should look like, and it's easier to keep private than to constantly defend his choices. The room was quiet again as they processed this information. We've been terrible family members, Diane said finally. You've been judgmental family members. But you can choose to be different going forward. My phone buzzed with a text from my property manager. The Harbor Point inspection is complete. Everything looks good for closing next week. I showed them the message. Harbor Point Marina, $31 million waterfront development project. If everything goes according to plan, it'll be the largest single acquisition in Sterling Capital's history. What will you do with it? Dad asked. Convert it into affordable housing for teachers, firefighters, and other essential workers. The city needs more housing for people who serve the community but can't afford market-rate apartments. That's really meaningful work. That's the point, Dad. Success isn't just about making money. It's about using resources to create positive change in the world. I picked up the foreclosure notice and tore it in half. Consider this officially canceled. I'll have my lawyer draw up a new mortgage agreement with terms that work for your retirement budget. Jessica, thank you. For everything. For forgiving us another chance, for teaching us to be better. Don't thank me yet, Dad. Thank me in a year when you've proven that you can see family members for who they really are instead of who you think they should be. As I left the house that afternoon, I reflected on the events of the past 18 hours. I'd gone from being publicly humiliated as a family failure to revealing myself as a multi-million-dollar business owner who literally controlled whether my family got to keep their home. But the most important change wasn't financial. It was the shift from being dismissed to being respected, from having my dreams questioned to having my achievements recognized. That evening, I sat in my downtown apartment, looking out at the city skyline where my properties dotted the landscape like proof of everything I'd built while others assumed I was building nothing. My phone rang. It was Marcus, my half-brother, not my attorney. Jessica? I heard about what happened last night. And this morning. Are you okay? I'm fine, Marcus. But I'm curious, how did you hear about it? Dad called me. He told me about the foreclosure notice, about your company, about everything. He sounded shaken. And what do you think about it? I think I owe you an apology. A big one. I've been just as dismissive as everyone else. Just as willing to assume you were failing instead of asking about your actual life. Yes, you have. Can we talk? Really talk? I'd like to know about your business, your life, who you really are instead of who I assumed you were. I smiled. I'd like that. But Marcus. Yeah. I'd also like to hear about David. Dad mentioned you're getting married next month. Silence. Then, how did you know about David? Because unlike the rest of this family, I pay attention to the people I care about. Congratulations, by the way. I'd love to meet him. Really? Really? And Marcus? If you need help with wedding planning or logistics, Sterling Capital has relationships with some excellent vendors in Napa Valley. You'd help us with our wedding? I'd be honored to help my brother celebrate the most important day of his life. When I hung up, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Genuine optimism about my family relationships. Not because they'd discovered I was wealthy, but because they'd finally opened their eyes to see the person I'd been all along. The foreclosure notice had been more than just a business transaction. It had been a moment of truth that forced everyone to confront their assumptions and see reality clearly for the first time in years. Sometimes the best revenge really is living well. But sometimes, if you're very fortunate, living well becomes the foundation for healing relationships that seemed broken beyond repair. And as I fell asleep that night in my luxury apartment, surrounded by the success I'd built while others thought I was failing, I realized that forgiveness felt better than revenge ever could have. The woman they'd tried to evict as a failure had become the person holding the keys to their future. But more importantly, she'd also become the bridge to a family relationship built on truth instead of assumptions, respect instead of judgment, and love that didn't depend on meeting other people's definitions of success.